All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I'm Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started, I thought I would talk to a couple of people. Unfortunately, one of them's not here tonight. Jeff, if you're out there somewhere, hope you're enjoying it on the video. But Bill Nolan, could you unmute for a minute and give us a little rundown on some of the writing opportunities that are available in SABR right now?
Well, I wasn't prepared for this.
I know.
We always have writing opportunities. I think right now there's a couple books aimed for next year, one on Satchel Paige and one on the Oakland Coliseum. And there probably are some available slots there. But anybody ever wonders, I've always got ideas. So anybody ever wonders if there's a game or a bio that they can take on, just send me a note and I'll find something for you.
What's that email address, Bill?
Well, it's in the SABR directory, oddly enough. It's a complicated one. It's Bill at, but then downtheroadrecords.com.
Doesn't sound too complicated, but I'll take your word for it. There were a couple of writing opportunities that were sent out today in the Monday message. So if you got that, check your inbox, take a look at that, and you'll see a couple of writing opportunities that are available for you there. Now that we've got that, on to our feature presentation. For 50 years, the farm system model created by Branch Rickey defined the structure of the minor leagues. But in the early 1990s, Major League Baseball forced minor league baseball to accept decreases in their support of personnel and financing. Miles Wolff, publisher of Baseball America and one of the losing minor league representatives, saw this change as an opportunity to develop an independent minor league. In 1993, the six-team Northern League, including a St. Paul franchise owned by Mike Veeck and Bill Murray, was in operation. Although the Northern League eventually folded, Wolff's concept flourished. This presentation chronicles Wolff's vital role in the independent league movement, which has become a well-established network of 7 leagues and 75 independent teams. Dr. John Burbridge Jr. is professor emeritus at Elon University, where he was both a dean and professor. While at Elon, he introduced and taught baseball and statistics. John has authored several SABR publications and presented at SABR conventions, 9 and Seymour meetings. He's a lifelong New York Giants baseball fan. Hey, Greg, you want to listen up now, man. The greatest Giants-Dodgers game he attended was a 1-0 Giants victory in Jersey City in 1956. And yes, the Dodgers played in Jersey City in 56 and 57. John Burbridge, welcome to Northern New England, my friend. How are you?
Thank you very much, Bruce. I appreciate that introduction. Let me give you a little vignette about that game, 1956. Years later, I'm a member of the New York Giant Preservation Society, and we have a breakfast in New York with the World Series trophy in 2011, and Willie Mays was there. And they each gave us James Hirsch's book on Willie Mays. And as I went up to get Willie to autograph it, I said to Willie, I says, a lot of people seen a lot of your home runs, but the one I remember is the one you hit in Jersey City to win the game 1-0. And Willie, without even looking up, said, off of Don Newcomb. So that's my little Willie Mays story for tonight. Okay, so let's kind of go to... You've done a wonderful introduction of independent baseball, and we'll talk a little bit about the Northern League and the rebirth of independent baseball. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, what is independent baseball? Well, it's teams or leagues with no affiliation with the major leagues, and the players are just under contract to the independent team. Now, as Bruce pointed out, with Rickey and the introduction of the farm system, before that, most teams were independent. After that, they became affiliated with major league teams. Recently, the Salt Lake Trappers in the Pacific Coast League, the Portland Mavericks in the single A level are recent examples of independent teams. By 1990, there were no independent leagues or teams in the USA. Let's go to the next slide then, Bruce. Okay, let me digress a little bit here on Miles Wolff, because he's the hero. He's the hero of this tale. Miles was born in Baltimore. I have to give a little bit of kudos to Baltimore. And at an early age, he moved to Greensboro, North Carolina, and he became quite a fan of the Greensboro team in the minor leagues. He went to a lot of games. After graduating from high school, he went up to Baltimore. I went to Johns Hopkins University and studied history. Also tried to get jobs with the Baltimore Orioles, but it was very unsuccessful. After graduating from Hopkins, he went to University of Virginia, did a master's thesis on the Woolworth's sit-ins in Greensboro, and he published that as a book. And you can get that book on Amazon if you're so interested. Then he joined the Navy, but he still had this love of the minor leagues. So once he got out of the Navy, in the 1970s, he bounced around and took a lot of little positions with minor league baseball. But he really wanted to own his team. And at the end of the 1970s, he had a great opportunity. And that opportunity was the Durham Bulls. The Sally League wanted a team in their league and possibly be Durham. And he knew people with the Atlanta Braves organization because that's where he had one of the teams he had kind of affiliated with back in the 1970s. So he basically, of course, then the Durham Bulls turned out to be extremely successful. And of course, in the mid-1980s, now Miles had an investor who was a movie producer in Los Angeles, and that investor convinced Ron Shelton that he should write a movie about not an independent team, about a minor league team. And of course, that movie became the Durham Bulls. Miles became very successful. Durham became very successful. Unfortunately, Miles couldn't get a new stadium, so he decided to sell the team. So that takes us to the late 1980s. While he also owned, besides the Durham Bulls, he also owned several other minor league teams, including a team about 25 miles west of Durham in the single A minor league. It was the Burlington Indians. And that becomes an important team for later as he gets involved in the 1990 negotiations. He also becomes the publisher of Baseball America, and that's an interesting story all in itself. And as a publisher, he had received inquiries from Duluth, Minnesota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Thunder Bay, Ontario, about possible minor league franchises. Next slide then, Bruce. Now, in 1990, the minor leagues were flourishing. They had bounced back from those TV wars that they had in the 50s and the 60s, and they were doing well, while the major leagues were struggling because of, well, free agency was coming out and there were strikes, etc. But what happened is every 10 years, the minor leagues and the major leagues would get together and they'd negotiate a contract agreement between the major leagues and the minor leagues. Miles was a representative of the minor leagues because of his relationship with the Burlington Indians. He expects a continuation of previous agreements, but to their surprise, the minor leagues learned that Major League is going to propose greater control of minor league operations, including new rules on player contracts, finances, and facilities, similar to what happened, just 4 or 5 years ago. Miles was prepared to vote no. He was not going to agree. But a Major League representative, Charles Sanders, who's affiliated with the Atlanta Braves, convinces Miles that if he votes no, it's going to be more onerous what the Major League is going to propose and force the minor leagues to accept. So Miles decides to vote yes to this contract between the minor leagues and the major leagues. But what this does is it reinforces Miles' interest now in creating an independent baseball league. And he also had that relationship with the Raleigh Ice Caps. It was a minor league team, minor league hockey team, and he realized that he could do it. He didn't have to worry about any kind of major league team pulling players or from his minor league team. So Miles became very interested in independent baseball. Okay, the next slide, Bruce. Okay, so given the interest in Duluth, Sioux Falls, Thunder Bay, Miles starts thinking about an independent league in the upper northern Midwest. And he visits these cities and he feels that they can indeed field viable franchises. They each have a stadium that can be renovated and will house a team. St. Paul, Minnesota was initially dismissed since it was only 7 miles from a major league team. But interesting, one of the owners of the St. Paul franchise and partner with Bill Veeck and Mike Veeck and Bill Murray was Marvin Goldline. And Marvin was based in New Jersey. And if he was going to own a team in the Northern League, he wanted a direct flight to that team. Now, the only team that he could own was then the St. Paul franchise. There was no direct flights from Newark to Duluth or Sioux Falls or Thunder Bay. So Marvin becomes involved with the St. Paul franchise along with Mike Veeck and Bill Murray and another owner, Von Schley. Other cities that were included were Sioux Falls, Iowa, and Rochester, Minnesota, although Sioux Falls needs a ballpark. But the mayor basically convinces Miles that you will have a ballpark for this team. Now, Miles now must find owners for these possible franchises. And we've already touched on, okay, next slide, Bruce. We've already touched on Marvin Goldline, Mike Veeck, Bill Murray, and Von Schley. They own the St. Paul franchise. Now, each one of them has an equal stake in this. I believe it's 22.5%. Each had an equal stake in the St. Paul franchise. Bill Pereira was in Sioux City, Bruce Engel in Duluth, Harry Stavranos in Sioux Falls, Ricky May in Thunder Bay, and Charles Sanders. Now, you notice that Charles Sanders. Remember, Charles Sanders was the individual that convinced Miles to vote yes when he was a representative of the Atlanta Braves in those 1990 negotiations. Well, Miles is good friends of him, and he convinces Charles to invest in the Rochester, Minnesota franchise for his first year of the Northern League. And Miles Wolff is going to be the commissioner. Next slide, then. Okay, now the arrangements was basically, Miles realizes that these owners are taking a big risk. And so to soften the blow, he says no franchise fee for the first 3 years. But obviously they have to cover all the expenses associated with the team, but no franchise fee. But if the league succeeded, the owner would pay Miles Wolff $50,000 as the organizer and commissioner. Now, the owners were responsible. Again, it's an independent league. There's no involvement of the major leagues. Owners were responsible for all facets of operation, including hiring the manager and staff, setting up tryout camps, selecting rosters. And again, what was then become very important to each one of these teams is that player development was not as critical. Winning was important. And what they really tried to do is create excitement about winning that pennant. Wolff established a salary cap of $72,000 per team per season. Now, one of the other things he got was the Major League Baseball to recognize Northern League contract. This wasn't going to be the same thing as back in the 1940s when some of the major league teams raided some of the Negro teams and just took players from the Negro teams, even if they did have a contract. But Major League Baseball is going to recognize the Northern League contracts, meaning the players could indeed be sold from a Northern League team to a Major League team. Next slide, Miles. Bruce. Okay, the rosters were limited to 22 players, with stipulations concerning the number of players at the various levels of experience. So, in other words, there could be only a couple of college graduate players, and there was a quota on the number of former major league players the team could have. Obviously, the players who were released in the minor leagues, became possibilities to play in the Northern League. College players who weren't drafted, managers, coaches, and executives who no longer had positions to organize baseball, and former major league players who don't want to hang up their spikes and want a second chance. And there's several of them, as we'll see, who play in the Northern League. Um, Now, it's interesting to note that while the Northern League started in 1993, there was another independent league that started in 1993, but that league only lasted a year. But there were several people that Miles had talked to who had got the idea also. So there was some interest in other leagues forming in addition to this Northern League. Okay, next slide. There's a 70 play began, as Bruce pointed out, play began in 1993. So it took a couple of years to get this whole thing up and going, get the stadiums ready, and get the teams to have a roster. There's a 71 game schedule with 2 half seasons. St. Paul Saints won both the league and the playoffs in that first year. Each team, except for the Rochester, Minnesota, was profitable, with St. Paul and Thunder Bay being the attendance leaders. At the end of the season, Rochester was sold to St. Cat's, and they became the Winnipeg team in the Northern League in 1994 and beyond. Duluth also has an ownership change, but they were actually somewhat profitable. Some of the players who played in the Northern League were Leon Bull Durham, Kevin Millar, and there's Minnie Minoso. Now, Minnie only makes a quick appearance in a game because I believe he played for St. Paul. What they want to do is make sure he had 6 decades of organized baseball. So he played in the Northern League in this one game. Interesting enough, he comes back in the years 2003 with another one of those appearances. So now we can say he played in 7 decades of organized baseball. Next slide, Bruce. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the St. Paul Saints, because this is without a doubt the most viable franchise with excellent attendance. And what it does is it kind of refutes any argument that a franchise next to a major league franchise would not be successful. They refurbished Midway Park in St. Paul, and that's where the St. Paul Saints play. Now, interesting, they signed Donald Strawberry in May 1996. Now, Strawberry does extremely well with the St. Paul Saints. He does so well that the Yankees kind of get an interest in him, and he is sold to the Yankees. So this is an example of a player playing in the Northern League who gets sold to the major leagues. They also signed Illa Borders. She becomes the first female to play on a professional men's baseball team since integration. Now, Illa had played quite a bit in college and was an accomplished baseball pitcher. She only lasts a couple of months with the St. Paul Saints, but I believe goes up to Duluth and plays for another 2 or 3 years in the Northern League. Next one. Okay, what's become famous for the St. Paul Saints, of course, Mike Veeck and all his promotions. And each seat, one of the things I loved is that he had a piglet that would bring the balls up to home plate. And each piglet had a name. And in 2001, that piglet was called Kevin Bacon. I have a little vignette. Miles wrote a book, and I think you can see it. There's a bulldozer on home plate. Talks a little bit about his experiences and also in the Northern League. And there's a little story in here about some of the issues associated with the pig. And this is a conversation between the league president of the Northern League and Miles, who is the league commissioner. And the league president says to Miles, "We just had a complaint on the pig in St. Paul." "Oh no," Miles says. "What's the complaint?" "The Duluth manager has called to say the pig that takes the baseballs to the umpires defecated on home plate in the 6th inning." Miles responds, "He actually used the word defecate?" "Absolutely. What do you want me to do?" "I'm not sure the bowel movements of a pig are the commissioner's concern." "Okay, tell him that. I will call the St. Paul GM and issue a stern warning that is against league rules for animals to take a dump on home plate in the course of play. If it happens again, the pig will either be fined or barbecued." "Will that take care of it?" "It should." Amazing. I don't think I've ever heard anyone in baseball say the word defecate. That's kind of a little vignette. I really would recommend, if you're interested in the Northern League and interested in Miles Wolff, this is an excellent book. There's a bulldozer home plate. Of course, that describes one of the teams that was having some trouble financially, and somebody put a bulldozer on home plate so they couldn't play any games. Okay. Probably the most famous individual that at the St. Paul Saints games was Sister Roz, and she was called the Saints stress reliever, and she was there at many years. In fact, I think she just retired just a few years ago, and she applied massages at the games. Of course, then he started a game at 5:35 a.m. in 2005. And in 2009, to commemorate Bruce Selig's decision to stop the All-Star game at 7-7, Mike Veeck came up with the idea of giving everybody who came to the game a free tie. And then in 2018, I can't imagine this, they had a food fight in honor of Animal House. Of course, this is the individual who also had the disco derby in Chicago, so he could come up with anything. And these are just a few examples of some of the promotions that Mike Veeck conjured up while owning the St. Paul Saints. Next slide. Okay, let's get back to the Northern League now. In 1996, you had expansion. New franchises in Fargo, North Dakota, and Madison, Wisconsin. By 2000, only the original St. Paul ownership was still in place. So you still had Mike Veeck, Bill Murray, and Marvin Goldline. I'm not sure if Von Schley still was in, because he wanted out after the first year or two. But let me just show you how the viability. Duluth was sold for $500,000, Thunder Bay for $750,000, and Sioux Falls for $1 million, illustrating the viabilities of these investments. Now, I think what might be of interest to you folks is that in 1999, the Northern League merged with another independent league, the Northeast League. And that Northeast League was mainly teams in New York State. Eventually, they ended up with Bangor, Maine as one of the teams, but they were mainly in New Jersey and New York State. And so they basically, the Northern League, they basically had two divisions. It was the Northern League out in the Midwest and the Northeast League. And they actually played against each other in kind of a independent World Series, and the Northeast League actually won 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2002. Also in 1999, Thunder Bay moves to Schaumburg, Illinois, while Madison moves to Lincoln, Nebraska in 2001. Next slide. Okay, in 2002, Gary, Indiana, and Joliet, Illinois were awarded franchise in the Northern League. 2002 also saw the end of the merger between the Northern and Northeast League. So the Northeast League becomes completely independent of the Northern League at that point in time. And the resignation of Miles Wolff as the commissioner of the Northern League. I got to add that Miles actually became the commissioner of the Northeast League at that time. And it's interesting that he was actually conducting all this commissioner business from his office in Durham, North Carolina, where Baseball America was headquartered. In 2003, Duluth moves to Kansas City, Kansas, while Calgary and Edmonton are added in 2004. After the 2005 season, St. Paul, Sioux City, Sioux Falls, and Lincoln left to join other teams in the American Association of Independent Professional Baseball. And that's a very viable league right now, the American Association of Independent Professional Baseball. Next slide. Following the 2007 season, the league was left with 6 teams as Calgary and Edmonton left to join the Golden Baseball League. And then Zion, Illinois was added as the Lake County Fielders, while Rockport moved into the league from the Frontier League in 2010. But Gary, Fargo, Winnipeg, and Kansas City joined the American Association, and that really is the end of the Northern League. The remaining teams found new homes, ending this incarnation of the Northern League. Of course, there had been several prior Northern Leagues, not necessarily independent, but this incarnation ended in 2010. Okay, so Miles, by the way, I talked a little bit about the Bangor, Maine franchise. I believe Miles buys that Bangor, Maine franchise and moves them to Quebec. And they're playing in that Northeast League, Quebec. So he not only is the commissioner, but he's also an owner in that league. And he continues that to 2011, then gets involved with Ottawa, also in the Northeast League. And that ends in 2019. Okay, let's go to lessons learned. The Northern League, Miles Wolff, proved that independent leagues and teams could indeed be successful. Obviously, there was financial issues with each one of these teams, each one of these leagues, but they could indeed be successful. I want to add that it also allows cities, and again, this is where I'm coming from. I live in South Central Pennsylvania. It allows cities such as York, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which are too close to Harrisburg to have an affiliated team. So they play in the Atlantic League, which is, we have our own War of the Roses down here with York and Lancaster in the Atlantic League. The St. Paul Saints showed that eliminating towns close to major league cities was unwise. And of course, that practice now you see a lot of teams, minor league teams, very close to their minor league affiliates, very close to their major league parent. Major League Baseball designated 4 independent leagues as partner leagues, including the Atlantic League, to experiment with rule changes. And a few years ago, I went to see a York Revolution game in the Atlantic League, which is one of those partner leagues. And they had a robo-ump. And it really, you never could really, I didn't see any difference between a regular umpire and this computer umpire. The only thing that happened about the 4th inning, one of the players questions the call, and the umpire just points to a computer and saying, I didn't make that call, the computer made that call. But Major League Baseball is still using these minor league independent teams as partners for possible rule change. I'll give you one little interesting anecdote. The Atlantic League uses the Johns Hopkins computer science students to come up with their schedule each year. And major leagues decided to give each one of the Atlantic League teams the TrackMan equipment to use in their ballparks. Now, the biggest problem with these teams is they're working on tight budgets. So they didn't have anybody who could do the analytics associated. So for the past year, Johns Hopkins students have been writing software for the Atlantic League teams so they could use the TrackMan data effectively preparing their teams for the upcoming games. Now, there are 9 independent leagues. Now, this was, I originally was going to prepare this. This was originally prepared for the SABR convention out in Minneapolis, but unfortunately I couldn't attend. I just did a Google search, and right now, according to my search, there are just 7 independent leagues existing right now. That could change. In fact, I've been tracking this for the last couple of years, and that varies between 7 and 10 independent leagues. But you have the American Association of Professional Baseball. They have 12 teams, East and West divisions. The Atlantic League has 10 teams. And some consider the Atlantic League as to be the highest level of independent baseball. By the way, I'm a Giants fan, and I went to saw a York Revolution game, and they played the Staten Island team, and Pablo Sandoval played third base for the Staten Island team. And he played all year for the Staten Island team. It was quite an attraction in the Atlantic League. The Frontier League has 14 teams and is the longest active running independent baseball league in the United States. Pioneer League is a partner league of the major leagues. The Empire League, which I guess is mainly in New York State, the Pecos League, and finally the United Shore Professional Baseball League. They are in existence. And now let me close by saying hopefully independent baseball is here to stay, and it kind of all began with the Northern League. But let me just point out, it's going to be a tough road for these leagues and for these teams. I happen to be in York, which is doing quite well, but there are constantly changes in franchises during from one season to the next as some of these teams don't succeed. So independent baseball is hopefully here to stay. Major League Baseball apparently has some interest in making sure they still continue in existence. I'm not exactly sure what that interest is, other than possibly trying out some of these new rules, but why can't they do that in their own affiliated leagues? But that concludes my presentation, and I appreciate you folks listening and being part of it, and open for any questions or comments you might have.
If you have a comment or question that you would like to give our presenter, John Burbridge, go down to the bottom of the screen, hit the react button. Once you do that, you'll see another button marked raise hand. Hit raise hand. We'll get you in line to ask your question or make your comment to our presenter, John Burbridge, tonight. You know, one of the things, John, that you mentioned was that the independent leagues have a bit of a tough go of it. I downloaded the American Association's app on my TV this year because they were giving away live streams of their games for free.
Wow.
And one of the things that I noticed, and I'm told that they have very good numbers when it comes to eyeballs streaming these games. But the fans in the stands, I hate to say it, they were disguised as empty seats.
Okay.
And I do you have any data, knowledge, or anything on attendance figures or what, one of these teams needs to turn a decent profit? Are these teams just hanging on? What's your comment on that?
Okay. The only thing I can really talk about is my little experience here in York, Pennsylvania. By the way, for that Pablo Sandoval game, they realized that this was going to be a draw, and they charged like $40 a ticket.
Oh my God.
So it was almost like going to a Major League game. but I would imagine I'm thinking is that they got to know their markets real well, and they do a lot of promotion stuff in the market, and they have to build a strong relationship with the community. And if they do that, they have a chance to surviving. And I think they get about 3 to 4,000 on average here in York. And I think the same thing is true for Lancaster. Um, but that's about all I know. I did touch this. There's a commissioner of the Atlantic League, and I mentioned that to him, and I think it's a closely guarded secret as to how viable these franchises are. So he wouldn't really comment too much on it.
That's
I did
very
that in
interesting.
preparation for the SABR presentation because I thought a question like yours would come up out at SABR. I mean, it's a very important, it's a very interesting question, and it's a very good question.
Now, I've always regarded the Atlantic League as kind of the top level of independent baseball. You mentioned that earlier in your presentation. And I got the chance years ago when I was living in Connecticut to go down to Bridgeport to see the Bluefish.
Yes,
One of the, I think they were a charter member of the Atlantic League, if I
I think they
recall
were.
correctly. And they had at the time a state of the art ballpark that drew very well for a number of years. Unfortunately, that ballpark has been bulldozed now. Bridgeport is no longer in existence, but it was good baseball, and there were names in that league. There still are today. You'll get some names in that league. It just seems to me that the Atlantic League has positioned themselves as a premium market or a premium product.
Now, but they've had to branch out into North Carolina, so now they
True.
have they have teams in High Point,
Mhm.
Gastonia, which have replaced some of the traditional Northeastern teams. One of the interesting franchises they did have a few years ago, Sugarland in Houston, was in the
Yes.
Atlantic League,
Yes.
and what that meant was a team would go down there for a week because and now that became part of affiliated baseball with the go around in 2020. So now I believe they're a franchise of they're affiliated with the Houston Astros, the Sugarland team, or the Texas Rangers, one of those teams down in
I think
Texas.
they're Houston's AAA team, if I remember
I
correctly.
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
had also mentioned the Northeast League from ages ago when once again I was living in Connecticut. I got to several Waterbury, Connecticut Spirit games.
Okay.
And as far as I am concerned, the Northeast League, at least in my experience, and I went to a lot of games in in Waterbury, uh, that was a very low level of play. My favorite memory of going to those games was there was a night that now Waterbury used to get um, dozens dozens in attendance at their game, dozens. And so there's one night they were playing a I can't remember who they were playing. I'd have to go back to Baseball Reference to look it up, but I can tell you who was suiting up for the visitors, and it was Pete Rose Jr.
Okay.
And they went from dozens in attendance to about 800 to 900 in attendance. And if you wanted to see a rowdy crowd go after one guy, this one night was completely crazy in that it was the old ballpark that the old Reds and the old Indians played in, and they were stomping on the wood floors and yelling at Pete Jr. And yeah, that's right. Danny played for the Jackals in '99 as well. And if I had a nickel for every one of the fans in that crowd that was asking him who he liked in Pimlico in the fifth, I could retire in front of you. Uh, it was bad. Dixie, Tarango, how you doing?
Let me
I'm
ask you a
doing
question on
fine.
that. The Jackals, is that the team that played in Montclair, or did they play at Sussex County in New Jersey?
Dan Chikalski, can you unmute?
Yep,
There you
yep,
are.
yep. Yeah, they were at Montclair State.
What's that?
They were at Montclair State, yes.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, now they're at Hinchliffe Stadium in Patterson.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Go ahead, Dix.
Okay, John, thank you very much for that presentation. Help me understand finances here. If the teams were allowed $72,000 and they had 22 guys on the team and they played 70 games, that's about $46 a game. How did that work?
They didn't get paid much. They just played for the love of the game.
So did they get any more money if they got a better attendance or anything, or was that it?
Well, that was the first year, and since then the budgets have increased. Again, they're not necessarily very open with their finances, but they're certainly not getting paid the same as minor league players in affiliated baseball.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure they're getting paid very little. If I recall, or maybe you can confirm this for me, John, SABR CEO Scott Bush was the assistant GM at the St. Paul Saints at one time. Is that correct?
He was with the St. Paul Saints. He worked for Marvin Goldline, Bill Veeck, and Bill Murray. Yeah, he worked for them for quite a few years.
Where do you see independent baseball going in the next, let's say, 10 years? Do you think we're going to see consolidation, folding, expansion? Where do you think it's going?
Well, I think what's critical is to find mid-sized towns that don't have affiliated baseball or possibly are excluded from having affiliated baseball, like York and Lancaster. I think York and Lancaster are two examples of cities that are fairly sizable, but they're not allowed to have affiliated baseball because they're too close to Harrisburg and they violate the agreement. So I think what they do is you got to cherry pick, and then you develop the relationships. And hopefully what you can do is get, like you have here in York and Lancaster, it can exist over several years and develop a fan base. I mean, I've got some neighbors who are just big fans of the York Revolution, go to the York Revolution almost every game because they've developed that relationship. So, and I think the South, Gastonia and High Point down in North Carolina are examples of sounds. But the problem with that is it increases your travel costs substantially. But that's my idea, is that you got to look and cherry pick some of these cities that crave minor league baseball and aren't going to get an affiliated team anymore with the. I mean, obviously, one of the advantages of independent league is that minor leagues, the affiliated leagues, are shrinking. I had a Aberdeen general manager of the Aberdeen team tell me there's some owners in baseball just want to do away with all the affiliated teams and just have training camps in Arizona and Florida. But obviously, over the last 5-7 years, there's been a shrinkage of the affiliated teams. So this has provided a bit of an opportunity for some of the minor league independent teams.
There are venues out there. I mean, the ballpark in New Britain, Connecticut hosted a Atlantic League team for a couple of years. They're now they're a collegiate league team. The Bees are. I can't think of what league. They're in the same league that Keene, New Hampshire is in. Escapes me right now. The Norwich, Connecticut ballpark is also used by an independent club, if I recall correctly. And venues have to be available because, as you put it, with the consolidation of the minor leagues, there's empty ballparks around that could use a ball club. You know? Matthew Glidden, you're up, man. How are you?
Good, thanks.
What's going on?
I think despite my long tenure now in the Boston area, the team that I have seen the most that's independent is the Chicago Dogs because they're so conveniently placed next to the O'Hare Airport.
Yep.
And I've noticed that they have brought a few people through there who are a little like your Pete Rose Jr. example. They're the peripheral draws, but they have some kind of major league name or major league experience. And I wonder, do the independent teams, do they look at those players on a regular basis in your thinking? Is it common enough for them to say, yeah, we'll absolutely sign, for the Dogs, we'll absolutely sign a Carlos Zambrano 5 years after he last pitched in the majors because he thinks he might want to someday. He goes out there, gives, up 5 runs in 2 innings. But for their purposes, they got the attention of Cubs fans who were willing to come down and pay $10 for a head instead of $80 a head to see a game. What's your take on how that type of naming figures into overall independent franchise plans and ticket sales?
How much does it cost to go to a Dog game?
$8 to $20, depending on where you sit.
Okay. Well, I think that's an example of, and their attendance is pretty decent.
Seems so. I mean, being right next to the airport, I can imagine that helps.
Yeah, they're right by O'Hare. Okay. Yeah. I that's an example of a team that you see quite a bit now. You get this huge metropolitan area, and it costs so much to go to see a Cubs game and a White Sox game. All of a sudden now, within the city limits, you got the Chicago Dogs. I believe it's within the city limits, and you can go and families can go there to see a game. And if you think about it, kids, if they're young enough, they probably don't even recognize the fact that they're seeing minor league baseball or independent baseball versus major league baseball. So it's a great opportunity for families, and I think that you'll see. I'm surprised there aren't more teams that are like the Dogs, where you get to a major metropolitan area and you put another team close by. Like it seems like Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, all of those cities, you could probably have a really successful team in addition to, because you got a baseball tradition in the community, and families want to go to see games, but they've been priced out of major league games.
Mm-hmm.
And
all right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And it's great when you go see somebody like I went and paid extra to go see Pablo Sandoval play for the Staten Island team. And the other interesting thing was my granddaughters all wanted to go see Staten Island play because they had a young lady playing for Staten Island a couple of years ago. So they're important.
Whitmore.
Figure out the little niches that they can increase attendance.
Speaking of attendance, I thought I would show this. I think everybody can see that on the screen right now. This is the Atlantic League attendance figures from last year. We see Long Island leading the league with 4,650 per game. They had 64 openings and nearly got 300,000 people into their ballpark. But on the converse, there are 5 clubs in that league that average fewer than 2,000 fans a game. One who averages fewer than 1,200 a game in Staten Island, as a matter of fact. And I can't understand for the life of me how you keep a ball club like that going with so few receipts or eyeballs on the product.
I think you'll see the Staten Island Ferry Hawks finding a new home fairly soon.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. I don't see High Point
White Sox game.
What's that?
How could you be priced out of a White Sox game?
They'll let you in for free.
They'll pay you.
They'll pay you to go in. You're right. I can't understand how High Point doesn't draw. High Point's always going. I mean, the High Point furniture markets in the spring and fall are not around the time that the Rockers are in season down there, and they're still drawing fewer than 2,000 a game.
What was attendance? What was High Point's attendance?
High Point's attendance 1,900 a game.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is marketing that these clubs are not doing. They're not connecting with the community in order to get eyeballs on the product. But I don't know. Joe Ross,
No, they're not
how you
doing.
doing?
Okay, thank you.
Go get them.
John, nice presentation. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I noticed that Nashua, which is a fairly good sized community, couldn't get enough people on a day-to-day basis to maintain the minor league team. So now they're a college wooden bat league team. Not the Cape Cod one, which of course is the best, but they're trying to be I would say a second best. One of the ways they keep costs down is they recruit local families to house the players.
Yeah.
And they get season tickets that's the payment they get. I don't think that quite covers the cost of having these kids live in the house and feeding them, but that's basically what they do. And that's one of the things I agree with what Bruce just said, or what Dixie said. I don't remember which one of you said it, about they don't do enough community engagement. Yeah, they sell the billboards around the outfield. Sometimes they put out a program. When I was the scorer in Boston, we used to put out a daily program because I did it, not because anybody else wanted it. It was a free handout and people loved it. I don't know too many clubs in that level that do that. So they don't send people to the community enough. And I think that's one of the things that keeps the number of fans down.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting. Thank you for commenting about families. By the way, New York Revolution, some of the players live with families in York, Pennsylvania also, because I guess to get that question that was raised earlier, how does a team survive on a $72,000 budget? Well, one of the reasons is some of the players end up living with families, and rather than so they I know some families who have hosted York Revolution players.
I think that's pretty common in places like Nashua. I think almost club was living with families. Now, there are probably a few stragglers who ended up in a local hotel, but not usually.
Anything else for John Burbridge tonight? This has been a really interesting presentation, John. I want to thank you very much for doing this for us. That was great.
You having me. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Now we're back Wednesday, 2 nights from now, Wednesday, January 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern, where Dan Shikalski. Jan, where are you, my dude? There he is.
Still
Dan,
here.
say hello.
Hello.
Hello. Dan's going to be with us, appearing with the East Coast Cooperative to give his presentation entitled Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days, From Speedball to Spitball. This is SABR's can't miss presentation of the week, so you're going to kick yourself if you don't join us. The sign-up link is in the chapter meeting booklet distributed each Monday and also available in the SABR events calendar at sabr.org/events. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you're not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. John Burbridge, you are fantastic. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We will see everybody Wednesday night. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah.